The wind that moved through the borderlands of the Arizona and New Mexico territories did not blow. It scoured. It was a living, breathing thing composed of grit, heat, and the scent of ozone from distant thunderheads that piled high against the southern horizon, but rarely broke their promises of rain. The earth here was cracked and sunburnt, a vast patchwork of ochre and burnt umber that stretched endlessly toward the jagged spine of blue mountains in the distance. Dust devils danced maniacally on the open plains, spinning towers of brown earth that rose and fell like the breath of a dying giant. Luke Carver sat astride his bay gelding, his hat pulled low against the glare. He was a man etched by the country he lived in, his face a map of lines deepened by 32 years of squinting into the sun. He rode the fence line of his property, a struggling spread that seemed to shrink a little more with every season of drought. The cottonwoods along the thin, miserable creek were shedding leaves early, their branches rattling like dry bones. He pulled the gelding up at the third waterhole. It was little more than a muddy depression. The water evaporated down to a scummy sludge that smelled of alkali and rot. Luke stared at it, his gloved hands resting on the pommel of his saddle. Around him, the cattle were thinning. He counted 19 head in this pasture, ribs showing through their dusty hides like the staves of a barrel. There should have been 40. He turned the horse toward the homestead, the animal stepping carefully over the rocky ground. Luke's home was a small cabin of rough-hewn logs with a porch that sagged on the left side, as if tired of holding itself up against the relentless western gravity. There was no smoke from the chimney. There was no one waiting to boil coffee or ask him how the fence line looked. Luke dismounted and tied the horse to the rail. He did not go inside immediately. Instead, he walked up the gentle rise behind the cabin, his boots crunching on the dry grass. 2 wooden crosses stood there, weathered gray by 3 winters. The names were carved deep, though the wind was doing its best to smooth them away. William Carver, Sarah Miller. Luke took off his hat, twisting the brim in his hands. The silence here was different than out on the range. It was heavier. "I checked the South Ridge today." "Will," Luke said, his voice a low rasp that barely carried past his own boots. "The wire is down again. I think it is rustlers, or maybe just the coyotes dragging carcasses through. I will fix it tomorrow." He shifted his weight, looking at the second cross. "Sarah," he said, softer this time, "the irises you planted are gone. The sun took them. I tried to haul water, but the creek is so low I can barely keep the stock alive. I am sorry." He stood there for a long time, the guilt sitting in his gut like a swallowed stone. It was a familiar weight. He told them what he always told them in the quiet moments, that he was sorry he had ever taken that contract with the Army. He told them that if he had been here instead of scouting for General Crook, maybe he could have stopped the skirmish that killed them. He told them he knew the faces of the men who did it, because he had helped the Army hunt their families first. It was a jagged, ugly truth. Luke had been a scout, a tracker who sold his knowledge of the land to the men in blue coats. He had justified it as a job, a way to build a stake for this ranch, for the life he wanted to give Sarah, but the cost had been paid in blood, Apache blood. And then, in retaliation, the blood of his own kin. He put his hat back on and walked down the hill, the shame walking in step with him. 2 days later, the supply wagon needed axle grease and flour, forcing Luke to ride into town. The settlement was a collection of clapboard buildings and adobe structures huddled together against the vast emptiness, as if afraid to be alone. The main street was a river of churned dust. Luke tied his horse outside the general store and stepped out of the blinding light into the dim, grain-scented interior. The air was stifling, thick with the smell of tobacco, sweat, and leather. At the counter, a storekeeper named Henderson was leaning forward, his face flushed. Standing before him was a small Apache woman, wrapped in a faded blanket, holding out a few coins. She looked at the floor, her stillness a sharp contrast to the man's agitation. "I told you," Henderson said, his voice loud enough to turn heads. "I do not trade with your kind. You take that money and you get out. We do not want you here." The woman did not move immediately. She pointed a slender, brown finger at a sack of cornmeal on the shelf. "No," Henderson snapped. He grabbed a broom from beside the counter and brandished it like a weapon. "Go on, get!" Luke stood by the door. His hands curled into fists at his sides. He knew this woman. She lived in a shanty town on the edge of the settlement, doing wash for the miners. She was harmless. He felt the urge to step forward, to put his money on the counter and buy the meal for her. He felt the ghost of his brother watching him, but he did nothing. He watched the woman turn, her face impassive, and slip out the door past him. She smelled of wood smoke and old fear. Luke looked away as she passed, unable to meet her eyes. "Well done, Henderson," a voice boomed from the back of the store. A ranch hand named Jubal was leaning against a stack of crates, a half-empty bottle of whiskey dangling from his hand. He was a big man, his face mapped with broken veins. "You cannot feed the stray dogs." Jubal laughed, wiping his mouth with a dirty sleeve. "You feed one savage, and 10 more come crawling out of the hills. We ought to shoot them on sight, like the wolves." Luke walked to the counter, keeping his eyes on the ledger open in front of Henderson. "I need a sack of flour and a tin of coffee," he said quietly. Henderson nodded, his righteous anger fading into a merchant's smile. "Good to see you. Carver, you hear the news?" Luke shook his head. "Sergeant Miller says there was another attack on the southern road, a freight wagon burned, driver killed. They say it is the Apache again. It is always the Apache." Jubal shouted. "I heard rumors. Carver, they say there is a camp up in the Dragoon Mountains. Not warriors, a camp of women, witches, they say. Leftover squaws, who managed to run when the army took the men. They say they are stealing cattle to survive." Luke paid for his goods, the coins clicking on the wood. He felt a cold prickle on the back of his neck. He had lost 3 heifers in the last month. Outside, he ran into Sergeant Miller, a man with a hard face and a uniform that had seen too much dust. The sergeant was leaning against a hitching post, rolling a cigarette. "Carver." The sergeant nodded. "Sergeant," Luke replied, securing his supplies to his saddle. "You heading out again?" "Soon," Miller said. "The colonel is tired of these raids. We are going to sweep the canyons north of the border, clean it out once and for all. If you see anything out on your spread, you ride in and tell us. You used to be the best tracker we had. We could use your eyes." "I am done with that," Luke said, tightening the cinch strap. "You are done when the job is done," Miller said, striking a match on his boot heel. "And the job is not done until every one of them is on the reservation or under the ground." Luke mounted his horse and rode out of town without looking back. He felt the stain of his silence clinging to him like the dust on his coat. He had not defended the woman. He had not argued with Jubal. He had not told the sergeant that a war against starving remnants was no war at all. He was a man who wanted only to be left alone. But the silence of the desert was beginning to sound like an accusation. Miles away, in a place where the maps of white men showed only blank space, the land rose into a fortress of red rock. The entrance to the canyon was a narrow fissure, invisible until one was standing directly before it. Inside, the walls soared upward, cutting a jagged slice of blue sky far above. This was the sanctuary of the forgotten. The camp was a collection of wickiups made from brush and scavenged canvas, huddled against the canyon walls to escape the midday sun. Strips of jerked meat hung from wooden racks, drying in the dry heat. The ground was hard-packed, swept clean by women who maintained order even at the edge of oblivion. Ayanna knelt by a small fire, turning a piece of hide over a smoking pile of sage. She was a woman of striking, severe beauty. Her hair 2 long braids of obsidian that fell over shoulders squared by burden. Her eyes were dark and watchful, holding a grief so old it had hardened into iron. Nalin, the matriarch of their small band, limped over to her. Nalin's leg had been shattered by a soldier's rifle butt 2 years ago, and it had healed crooked. But her mind was as sharp as the skinning knife at her belt. "The water skins are low." "Ayanna," Nalin said, her voice like grinding stones, "and the meat will not last another moon." Ayanna did not look up from her work. "We have hunters out. We have old men and boys out," Nalin corrected gently. "The warriors are gone. Daughter dead or in chains at San Carlos. We cannot stay here. The winter will come, and the canyon will turn into an icebox. We are not going to the reservation, Ayanna said, her voice snapping with sudden ferocity. She looked up, her eyes blazing. I will not take my sister's children to a place where they die of coughing sickness and eat flour filled with weevils. We may not have a choice, Nayland said. Sani's boy is sick again. The cough is deep in his chest. Let him cough in freedom, then, Ayanna said, though her voice wavered. She looked across the camp to where Sani, a young woman with hollow cheeks, was rocking a bundle wrapped in rabbit fur. Ayanna rose and walked over to them. The child, a boy of 4 winters, was pale, his breath rattling in his small chest. Sani looked up, fear plain in her wide eyes. He is hot. Ayanna, Sani whispered. Ayanna placed a hand on the boy's forehead. It burned. She felt a surge of helpless rage. Rage at the soldiers. Rage at the land that yielded nothing. Rage at the men who had invaded their world and left them with nothing but dust. I will find sage and willow bark, Ayanna promised. Keep him warm. That night, the women gathered around the central fire. The fuel was scarce, mostly dried mesquite roots, and the flames were low. There were 12 adult women, 4 old men who could no longer fight, and 7 children. This was what remained of a band that had once numbered in the hundreds. They spoke in low tones, passing a single pipe. They spoke of the old days, not as a comfort, but as a way to keep the history from vanishing into the wind. Do you remember the treaty at Fort Defiance? An older woman named Chi asked. They gave us blankets with the smallpox. Ayanna spat, staring into the embers. They promised us the river valley, Nayland added. Then they found gold in the sand, and the promise turned to lead. Ayanna pulled her knees to her chest. She remembered the morning the soldiers came to her village. It had been dawn, the sky the color of a bruised plum. She remembered the sound of the bugle, cheerful and bright, followed by the thunder of hooves. She remembered running with her husband, the baby in her arms. She remembered the crack of the rifle that took her husband down. She remembered the second shot that had gone through the bundle in her arms. She had not screamed then. She had gone silent, a silence that had lasted for months. Now, that silence was filled with a cold, directional hatred. I will never trust them, Ayanna said, her voice cutting through the quiet of the canyon. Not the soldiers, not the ranchers. They are all the same. They are locusts. They eat the world until there is nothing left. But we are starving. Ayanna, Sani said softly, better to starve on our feet than to live on our knees. Ayanna replied, if a white man ever comes to this canyon, I will kill him myself. I will cut out his heart and leave it for the buzzards. The women fell silent. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks toward the stars. High above, on the rim of the canyon, a coyote howled, a long, mournful sound that echoed the emptiness in their bellies. Luke Carver found the tracks 3 days later. He had ridden out at first light, heading toward the broken country where the foothills collided with the mountains. 2 more steers were missing. A rancher could not afford to lose stock, not with the price of beef dropping and the bank in Tucson threatening to call in his loan. The land here was treacherous. It was a maze of dry washes, slot canyons, and ridges of crumbling shale. The sun hammered down, turning the air into a shimmering curtain of heat. Luke reined in his horse and dismounted. Crouching by a patch of soft sand, he traced the hoofprint of a steer, deep and panicked, and over it, the print of an unshod pony. So Jubal was right, Luke muttered. He checked the Winchester in his saddle scabbard, loosening it just enough to be ready. He climbed back into the saddle and followed the trail. It led deeper into the Badlands, winding through corridors of rock that blocked out the horizon. The silence was absolute. There were no birds here, no wind, just the sound of his horse's hooves clattering on stone. Luke felt the hair on his arms stand up. He had felt this before, years ago, when he was scouting ahead of a column. It was the feeling of eyes upon him. He scanned the ridges, his gaze moving methodically from shadow to shadow. He saw nothing but rock and scrub brush. He rode for another hour. The canyon narrowed. The walls grew steeper, closing in like the jaws of a trap. He should turn back. He knew that. He was one man, alone. But the anger at the theft, the stubborn pride of a man who had lost almost everything else, pushed him forward. He wanted to know who was taking what was his. He rounded a sharp bend in the canyon floor, a massive boulder obscuring the path ahead. The ambush was not a sound, it was a physical impact. As he passed the boulder, a rope hissed through the air. It settled over his shoulders before he could react. The loop tightened, pinning his arms to his sides. Luke shouted, spurring his horse, but the rope went taut with a brutal jerk. He was ripped backward out of the saddle. He hit the ground hard, the wind driven from his lungs in a dusty whoosh. He scrambled to his feet, gasping, instinct taking over. He saw movement, figures rushing from the rocks. He couldn't reach his rifle. It was still on the horse, which was bolting down the canyon. He reached for the colt on his hip, but a second rope snagged his ankle. He was yanked off his feet again, face planting into the gravel. Luke rolled, spitting blood and dust. A figure loomed over him, a warrior with gray hair and a face like a dried apple. The man held a club. Luke lashed out, driving his fist into the man's knee. The old warrior grunted and buckled, but he did not let go of the rope. Then they were on him. Not a horde of screaming braves, but a flurry of desperate strength. Hands grabbed his jacket, his hair, his boots. He kicked out, connecting with something soft. He managed to stand, swinging wild punches. He struck a shoulder, a jaw. He saw a braid whip through the air. A woman. The realization froze him for a split second. In that hesitation, a heavy piece of driftwood cracked against the back of his head. The world went white, then gray. Luke crumpled to his knees. Rough hands stripped the gun belt from his waist. He felt his pockets being turned out. His knife was taken. His watch, Sarah's watch, was ripped from his vest. He blinked, trying to clear the swimming vision. He was surrounded by 6 or 7 people. 2 were old men, their chests heaving with exertion. The rest were women. They were dressed in tattered buckskins and trade cloth, their faces streaked with dust and fury. "Get up!" someone commanded in Apache. Luke understood the tone, if not the word. He was hauled to his feet. His hands were wrenched behind his back and bound with rawhide, tight enough to cut off the blood. A rope was tied around his neck, the other end held by one of the old warriors. They did not kill him. This surprised him. In the stories told in the saloons, the Apache killed men where they found them. "Move!" The warrior grunted. Jerking the rope, they began to march. It was a brutal pace. Luke stumbled over loose scree, his head throbbing in time with his heartbeat. The sun beat down on his bare head. They had taken his hat. They led him deeper into the labyrinth of canyons, along paths that no horse could navigate. They scrambled up shale slides and squeezed through cracks in the rock. As they walked, the adrenaline faded. Leaving room for observation, Luke looked at his captors. They were thin, painfully thin. The women's collarbones stood out sharply. The old men moved with the stiff gait of starvation. They passed the remains of an old camp, perhaps a week abandoned. There were blackened circles of ash and the bones of a mule, cracked open for the marrow. Further on, they passed a shallow grave, barely covered with rocks. A small pair of moccasins had been left on top of the cairn. Luke looked at the woman walking beside him. She was young, perhaps 20. She glared at him with a hatred so pure it felt like heat, but her lips were cracked from dehydration. These were not the bloodthirsty raiders from the dime novels. These were people walking on the edge of death. They are starving, Luke thought, the realization hitting him harder than the club had. They are stealing cattle because they are dying. He remembered the storekeeper refusing to sell the cornmeal. He remembered his own silence. The guilt he had carried for 3 years shifted, changing shape. It was no longer just about the past. It was about the present. He was part of the machine that was grinding these people into the dust. The leader of the group, the gray-haired warrior, stopped and pointed upward. Ahead, the canyon wall seemed to split. A narrow, hidden trail switched back and forth up the sheer rock face. "Up," the warrior said. Luke looked at the trail, then at the faces surrounding him. There was no mercy there. Only a desperate, terrifying need. He began to climb, the rope around his neck pulling tight, leading him into the heart of the enemy camp, and toward a judgment he was beginning to fear he deserved. The journey up the hidden trail had been a blur of gray stone and gasping breath, but the arrival at the camp was a collision with a wall of sound and smell. Luke was shoved forward, stumbling over the lip of the canyon floor, and fell hard onto the packed earth. The dust puffed up around him, coating his tongue with the taste of copper and dry rot. He tried to push himself up, but a boot, moccasin-clad and hard as iron, shoved him back down. He stayed there for a moment, his chest heaving, listening to the sudden cessation of noise. The camp had been alive with the sounds of daily labor, but now it held the heavy, suffocating silence of a courtroom before a verdict. "Get up," the old warrior commanded. Luke scrambled to his knees and then to his feet. He swayed, the blood rushing in his ears. He looked around. The camp was nestled in a wide amphitheater of red rock, protected on three sides by sheer cliffs that climbed halfway to heaven. Wickiups made of brush and canvas were scattered like tossed tumbleweeds. The air was thick with the smell of burning mesquite, cured leather, and the distinct, sharp tang of unwashed bodies and fear. But mostly, the air was thick with resentment. He was standing in the center of a loose circle. It was not a war council of painted braves, as the dime novels back east would have had it. It was a circle of women. There were perhaps 30 of them, ranging from young girls with wide, terrified eyes to ancient grandmothers whose faces were webs of wrinkles. They stared at him not with curiosity, but with a cold, appraising hostility. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, their dark eyes darting between Luke and the weapons held by the few old men who stood guard. Luke felt naked, though he was fully clothed. He had been stripped of his gun belt, his knife, his hat, and his dignity. He stood before them, a white man in a world where his skin was a uniform of death. Ayanna stepped forward from the circle, up close. She was even more formidable than she had been during the ambush. She was not tall, but she held herself with the tension of a drawn bowstring. Her buckskin dress was stained with grease and earth, and her hands were scarred from work, but her face was struck from flint. She looked at Luke as one might look at a rattlesnake found in a cradle. "Why is he breathing?" Ayanna asked, her voice clear and cutting. She did not look at Luke. She looked at the old warrior who had brought him in. "We do not need another mouth to feed. We do not need a spy to lead the bluecoats here. He is a rancher." The warrior grunted. "He has strong hands. He has a white heart." Ayanna spat. She turned to the other women, her voice rising. "Do you not see? He tracks like a wolf. If we let him live, he will escape. If he escapes, he brings the soldiers. If the soldiers come, we die. All of us." She pointed a finger at Luke, trembling with rage. "Kill him now. Put his head on a stake at the canyon entrance. Let the white men see what happens when they come for us." A murmur of agreement ran through the circle. Several of the younger women nodded, their faces hardening. Luke felt the sweat trickle down his spine. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he was seconds away from dying. He thought of the graves on the hill behind his cabin. He thought of Sarah. Wait. The single word cracked through the tension like a whip. The circle parted, and Naylin limped forward. She leaned heavily on a staff of polished juniper wood. Her hair was entirely white, caught in a loose knot at the nape of her neck. She was old, her body twisted by injury and time, but her eyes were black glass, sharp and unyielding. Naylin stopped in front of Luke. She looked him up and down, inspecting his boots, his hands, the width of his shoulders. It was the way Luke looked at a horse at an auction. "He is strong," Naylin said, her voice dry and rasping. "He is an enemy," Ayanna countered, though her tone lost some of its edge in the presence of the matriarch. "He is a resource," Naylin corrected. She turned to Ayanna. "You want to kill him for revenge? Daughter, that is a luxury we cannot afford. Revenge does not fill the waterskins. Revenge does not chop the wood. Revenge does not mend the corral fences." She turned back to Luke. "What is your name?" "White man." Luke swallowed. His throat felt like it was full of sand. Luke Carver. Carver, Nellen repeated, testing the sound of it. She stepped closer, smelling of sage and old smoke. Tell me, Carver, where are the soldiers? I do not know, Luke said. Do not lie to me, Nellen said softly. She did not raise her voice, but the threat was there, sharp as a knife. We know they are moving. We have seen the dust. Where are they going? They are sweeping the southern range, Luke said, the words tumbling out. He felt a stab of shame at the betrayal of his own people, but the instinct to survive was louder. Sergeant Miller said they are moving toward the border. They are looking for stragglers. Stragglers, Ayanna repeated bitterly. That is what they call us, not people, stragglers. Debris to be swept away. Nalen silenced her with a raised hand. And your ranch? Is anyone waiting for you? No, Luke said. I live alone. Good, Nalen said. She looked around the circle, meeting the eyes of the other women. Our men are gone. Some are dead. Some are rotting in the prison at San Carlos. We have only boys and old ones left. The work is hard, and our backs are breaking. She pointed her staff at Luke's chest. This man owes a debt. His people have taken our land. They have taken our buffalo. They have taken our husbands. So, he will take their place. Not as a husband, but as a beast of burden. Ayanna stepped forward, protesting. He is dangerous. Nalen, he is only dangerous if we let him be, Nalen said. She looked at Luke, her eyes narrowing. Listen to me, Carver. You want to live? Yes, Luke whispered. Then you will work, Nalen said. You will do what the women of this camp tell you to do. You will carry the heavy loads. You will dig the holes. You will fix what is broken. You will be hands and a back for every woman here. She leaned in close, her face inches from his. You will please us, she said. The words were heavy with a dark, biting irony. You will please us with your labor. You will please us with your obedience. As long as you are useful, you breathe. The moment you become a burden, or the moment you try to run, Ayanna will get her wish. Do you understand? Luke looked at the ring of faces. He saw no pity. He saw only a grim pragmatism. He was being offered a life, but it was the life of a mule. I understand, Luke said. Nalen nodded once. Take him to the horse lines. Tie him there. He can start by cleaning the filth from the corral. Let him smell the dung of the horses he tried to steal. The first week was a blur of agony that stripped Luke of every layer of pride he had ever possessed. They did not keep him in a cell. The canyon itself was the prison. By day, his hands were unbound, but he was watched constantly by the old warriors or by Ayanna, who sat in the shade sharpening her knife, her eyes never leaving him. By night, he was tied to a stake near the horse corral, sleeping on a rough pallet of woven grass that offered no protection from the cold ground. His day began before dawn. A bucket of cold water was thrown on him, usually by one of the younger boys, who would giggle and run away. Luke would wake shivering, his joints stiff, his stomach cramping with hunger. His first task was water. The spring that fed the camp was a trickle located half a mile up a steep, rocky incline. Luke was given 2 large wooden buckets, suspended from a yoke that sat across his shoulders. He had to make 5 trips every morning. The path was treacherous, slick with loose shale. On the second day, his legs trembling from exhaustion, Luke slipped. He went down hard, the buckets crashing, the precious water spilling into the thirsty dust. He lay there for a moment, staring at the wet stain on the red earth, despair washing over him. Get up! Ayanna's voice lashed at him from the rocks above. Luke looked up. She was perched on a boulder like a hawk. I slipped, Luke gasped, struggling to his feet. The water does not care why it was spilled, Ayanna said coldly. It is gone. Go back and fill them again. And this time, if you spill it, you will not drink tonight. Luke glared at her. I am doing my best. Your best is weak, she said. A white man's best is soft. You are used to sitting on a horse while the animal does the work. Here, you are the animal. He hauled the water until his shoulders were raw. the wood of the yoke rubbing the skin away. He hauled until his boots began to crack and his hands were a landscape of blisters. After the water came the wood. The women needed fuel for the fires, but the canyon floor had been picked clean long ago. Luke had to climb the high ridges to find dead ironwood and mesquite. The wood was hard as stone. He had only a dull hatchet, and he chopped until the vibrations rattled his teeth. One afternoon, in the blistering heat of midday, Luke was digging a new latrine pit at the far edge of the camp. The ground was like concrete, a mix of clay and rock. The pickaxe struck sparks with every swing. He paused to wipe the sweat from his eyes, leaning on the handle, his chest heaving. Is the white man tired? Luke turned. Ayanna was standing there, holding a water skin. She took a long, slow drink, letting a few drops run down her chin, knowing he was watching. I am not tired, Luke rasped, his voice a dry croak. I am thirsty. Thirst is a good teacher, Ayanna said. She corked the skin. It teaches you to be grateful for what you have. Luke swung the pickaxe again, driving it into the earth with a grunt of rage. I am grateful I am not you, he muttered. Ayanna stepped closer. What did you say? I said I am grateful I do not have a stone where my heart should be. Luke snapped. He dropped the pickaxe and turned to face her, his patience snapping. I am working. Ayanna, I am doing what you asked. Why do you hate me so much? Is it just the color of my skin? Or is it because I am a man? Ayanna's face darkened. She stepped into his space, fearless. You think this is about skin? You think this is about you being a man? She gestured to the camp behind them. Look at them. Carver. Look at Sani. Her husband was shot in the back while he was planting corn. Look at Nalin. She walks with a stick because a soldier broke her leg for sport. You think I hate you because you are white? I hate you because you represent the end of my world. She poked a finger into his chest. Hard. You represent the disease. You represent the whiskey. You represent the lies written on paper. You stand there and ask me about my heart? Who helped the soldiers find us? Luke froze. The accusation hit the mark. How did she know? I was a scout, Luke said quietly. I did a job. You hunted people, Ayanna said, and now you dig holes in the dirt. It fits you better. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the sun, the shame burning hotter than the heat on his neck. Yet, as he watched her walk, he felt a strange, reluctant pull. She was cruel, yes, but she was burning with a fire that he had not seen in anyone, white or Apache, in a long time. She was alive in a way he had forgotten how to be. In the second week, Nalin began to rotate his tasks. He was no longer just a brute force laborer. He was lent out to the different women of the camp like a tool from a communal shed. Today, you help Sani, Nalin ordered one morning. Sani was the young mother with the sick boy. She was gentler than Ayanna, her eyes wide and skittish. She led Luke to the camp's secondary well, a deep hole lined with stones that had begun to collapse. It is dangerous, Sani whispered. The earth falls in. I cannot go down there. Luke looked at the well. It was a death trap. If the walls gave way while someone was at the bottom, they would be buried alive. Do you have rope? Luke asked. Sani nodded and brought him a coil of braided rawhide. Luke tied it around his waist and handed the end to Sani and two other women who had gathered. Hold this tight. If I shout, you pull. Do not hesitate. He lowered himself into the darkness. It was cool and smelled of wet earth. He worked for hours, wedging flat stones into the gaps, shoring up the crumbling sides. It was delicate, dangerous work. His hands, calloused and bleeding from the wood chopping, had to be precise. When he climbed out, covered in mud, Sani was waiting with a gourd of water. She handed it to him, her fingers brushing his. Thank you, she said softly. Luke drank, the cool water sliding down his throat like a blessing. It is fixed. Sani, but tell the children to stay away from the edge. Sani smiled. A fleeting, shy thing. You have good hands, Carver, for a white man. The next day, he was sent to help a widow named Asan. She was trying to build a stone windbreak for her wickiup. The stones she had chosen were massive, river-smooth boulders that weighed as much as a calf. Luke moved them. He set his shoulder against the rock, gritting his teeth, driving with his legs. He sweated and strained, moving rocks that would have taken the widow a week to drag. When he finished, Dasan did not thank him with words. She simply handed him a piece of dried venison, the first meat he had eaten in 10 days. Luke ate it slowly, savoring the salt and the gaminess. Then there was Chi, the grandmother. She was trying to drag a bundle of firewood with a rope tied in a clumsy knot that kept slipping. Luke watched her struggle for a moment, then stepped forward. "Let me," he said. Chi glared at him. "I do not need help. The knot is wrong," Luke said. "It will slip every time the wood hits a rock." He knelt and retied the rope, fashioning a timber hitch that tightened under tension but released easily when slackened. "Try it now," Luke said. Chi pulled. The wood followed obediently. She looked at the knot, then at Luke. She grunted. "The white man knows ropes." She muttered, "Perhaps he is not entirely useless." It was a small victory, but it mattered. Luke realized that Naylin was testing him. Yes, but she was also weaving him into the fabric of their survival. He was becoming necessary. And in becoming necessary, he was becoming less of a ghost and more of a man. One late afternoon, the heat broke as the sun dipped below the canyon rim, bathing the camp in a violet twilight. Luke was sitting near the corral, mending a bridle with an awl he had been given. A commotion near Sani's wickiup caught his attention. He looked up to see Sani weeping, rocking back and forth. Her son's cough had turned into a terrifying, barking spasm that echoed off the canyon walls. The women abandoned their tasks. They moved like a single organism, converging on Sani's shelter. Ayana was there, and Nalin, and Chi. Luke watched from a distance. He expected a ritual, some chanting or shaking of rattles. Instead, what he saw was a quiet, profound tenderness. Naylin knelt and placed her hands on the boy's chest. Ayana brought a bowl of steaming water infused with crushed creosote and held it under the boy's nose, urging him to breathe the steam. Sani held the boy's hand, singing a low, repetitive melody that sounded like the wind in the grass. Another woman brought a cool, wet cloth and wiped the boy's face. They formed a wall of bodies around the child, a shield of maternal will against the darkness. Luke stopped working. He sat there, the awl loose in his hand, and felt a lump form in his throat. He remembered the night Sarah died. He remembered the doctor in town shaking his head, the cold sterility of the room. He remembered the feeling of being utterly alone in the universe. These women had nothing. They were starving, hunted and living in the dust. But they had this. They had a bond that was stronger than iron. They shared the grief, just as they shared the food. He looked at Ayana. Her face was softened by the firelight, the hardness gone. She looked young and scared, just a woman trying to keep a child from slipping away. For the first time since his capture, Luke did not see them as Apache. He did not see them as the enemy. He saw them simply as people, clinging to one another on the edge of the world. And he realized, with a jolt of painful clarity, that he was the intruder here. He was the alien. That night, the wind picked up, moaning through the crevices of the rocks. Luke lay on his pallet, staring up at the slice of stars visible between the canyon walls. A coyote howled in the distance, a lonely, shivering sound. Sleep would not come. The scene with the sick boy had unlocked a door in his mind he usually kept bolted shut. He closed his eyes and he was back in the tent, the canvas flapping in the wind, the smell of cigar smoke and whiskey. General Crook was tracing a line on a map with a gloved finger. "They are using these canyons to move between the reservations and Mexico," the general said. "We need to close the door." Young Will, Luke's brother, was leaning over the table, his face flushed with excitement. "We can clean them out. General, if we hit the water holes, they will have nowhere to go." And Luke was standing there, silent. He knew the land. He knew where the water was. He knew the hidden trails. "Carver," the general asked, "is this the route?" Luke saw his own hand reaching out. He saw his finger tapping a spot on the map, a spot that looked exactly like the shape of this canyon. "Yes, sir," Luke said. "That is the place. If you block the southern pass, you trap them." Luke opened his eyes, gasping as if he had been underwater. The shame was a physical pain, a gnawing rat in his gut. He had drawn the map. He had pointed the finger. He had sent the soldiers who broke Nalin's leg, who killed Sani's husband, who made Ayana a widow. He looked across the sleeping camp. The fire had burned down to embers. He wanted to get up and run. He wanted to flee into the dark and never look back, but he knew he couldn't. He was bound here, not by Nalin's ropes, but by the weight of what he had done. A few nights later, the sound of a drumbeat woke him. It was a soft, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat. Luke sat up. The women were gathered around the fire again, but this was not a council. A young girl, one who had recently come of age, was dancing. She moved with small, shuffling steps, her arms raised to the sky. She held a cane adorned with feathers. The other women sang, a high, keening sound that seemed to vibrate in the rocks. It was the sunrise dance, or something like it. Luke had heard of it but never seen it. He watched, mesmerized. The dance went on for hours. It was endurance. It was prayer. It was a defiance of the exhaustion that plagued them. The girl looked exhausted, but the older women danced beside her, supporting her, lending her their strength. "You are spying again." Luke jumped. Ayana was standing just outside the circle of light, watching him watch them. "I am not spying," Luke said, keeping his voice low. "I am listening." "You mock us," Ayana said, her voice tight. "You think it is savage. You think it is foolishness to dance when our bellies are empty." "No," Luke said. He looked back at the dancer. "Tell me then, white man, what do you see?" Luke hesitated. He struggled to find the words. I see that you are holding her up. I see that she is tired, but you will not let her fall." Ayana fell silent. She had expected an insult. She had expected him to laugh. "It is beautiful," Luke added softly. "I do not understand the words. I do not know who you are singing to, but it is beautiful." Ayana looked at him, really looked at him, for a long moment. The firelight caught the sharp angles of her face. She looked confused, as if he had spoken in a language she did not know she understood. "You are a strange enemy." "Carver," she whispered. Then she turned and walked back to the fire, leaving him alone in the dark. The truce, fragile as it was, nearly broke 2 days later. Luke was working near the horse corral, repairing a section of fence where the rails had rotted through. The horses were nervous today. The wind was gusting, carrying the scent of something that made them spook, perhaps a mountain lion, or just the coming storm. The corral held 6 horses, tough, wiry Mustangs that were the tribe's most valuable possession. Among them was a black stallion with a white blaze, a new capture that was still half wild. Luke had his back to the gate, wrestling a heavy cedar post into place. He heard a soft giggle. He turned. It was Sani's boy, the one who had been sick. He was better now, and he had wandered away from his mother's watchful eye. He was standing inside the corral, toddling toward the black stallion. The boy held out a handful of dry grass. "Horse," he chirped, the stallion's ears pinned back. It snorted, pawing the ground. The sudden movement of the small child startled it. Luke dropped the post. "No!" he shouted. The stallion reared, a towering shadow of muscle and hooves. It screamed, twisting in the air, its front legs lashing out. The boy froze, looking up with wide, uncomprehending eyes. Luke didn't think. There was no time to think. There was no time to remember that he was a prisoner, or that these were the enemy. He vaulted the fence. He hit the dirt running, throwing himself between the horse and the child. He didn't try to grab the boy. There wasn't time. Instead, he threw his arms up, making himself big, and roared, "Hia! Back!" The stallion, startled by the new, aggressive presence, twisted in midair. Its hoof grazed Luke's shoulder, a blow that felt like a hammer strike. Spinning him around, Luke ignored the pain. He lunged for the stallion's halter. His hand closed around the rawhide cheek piece. He yanked the horse's head down, using his weight to force the animal off balance. "Easy," Luke gritted out, hanging on as the horse thrashed. "Easy, you devil!" He drove his shoulder into the horse's neck, murmuring the low, rhythmic sounds he used on his own stock. "Whoa, that is enough. Whoa!" The stallion shuddered, its eyes rolling white, but it stopped rearing. It stood there, flanks heaving, trembling with adrenaline. Luke held it for a heartbeat longer, then slowly released the halter, backing away with his hands raised. He turned. Sani was already in the corral, scooping her son into her arms, sobbing hysterically. The entire camp had frozen. Every eye was on Luke. He stood there, dusting off his pants, his shoulder throbbing with a dull, sickening ache. He felt the familiar rush of the adrenaline crash. Ayanna was standing by the gate. She looked at the stallion, then at the crying child, and finally at Luke. Her face was pale. She walked over to him. She did not raise her voice. She did not scold him. "You could have let the horse kill him," she said. It was a statement, not a question. "It would have been one less Apache to grow up and fight your people." Luke looked at her, rubbing his injured shoulder. "He is a boy. Ayanna, he is not a war." Ayanna stared at him. The silence stretched between them, thin and taut. For the first time, the hate in her eyes was gone, replaced by something else. Shock, perhaps, or a grudging, painful respect. She reached out, her hand hovering for a second as if she might touch his arm, then dropped it. "Thank you," she said. The words were stiff, foreign in her mouth. She turned and walked to Sani, putting a protective arm around the younger woman. Luke watched them go. He leaned against the fence, the pain in his shoulder sharp and real. He looked at the stallion, which was now watching him with wary curiosity. "We are both stuck here, friend," Luke whispered to the horse. But as he looked around the camp, he saw the way the other women were looking at him now. The cold appraisal was cracking. Nayland gave him a slow, deliberate nod from across the fire. The wall was breaching, and Luke wasn't sure if that made him safer, or if it put him in more danger than he had ever been in his life. The days bled into one another, losing their names and becoming a single, unbroken ribbon of heat and labor. Weeks stretched into a month, and the canyon, once a prison of red walls and hostility, began to feel like a strange, hard-edged home. Luke Carver was changing. The change was written on his body. The sun had burned his skin to the color of cured leather, peeling away the pale tan of the rancher to reveal something darker and rougher beneath. His hands, once used to the reins of a horse and the smooth wood of a rifle, were now mapped with new calluses, thick pads on his palms from the hoe, cuts on his knuckles from the rock, and a permanent stain of earth under his nails that no amount of scrubbing could remove. He was no longer the white stranger tied to the post. He was a functioning cog in the machinery of the camp's survival. It started with the rope. One afternoon, sitting in the shade of a mesquite tree, Luke watched a young boy struggling to braid a lead line from strips of raw hide. The boy was clumsy, his small fingers fumbling with the slippery leather. The resulting rope was lumpy and weak. Luke watched for a long time. Finally, he picked up a scrap of hide and moved closer. "Watch," Luke said. The boy looked up, wary, but curiosity won out. Luke worked slowly. He split the hide into 4 strands instead of 3. He showed the boy how to weave them, over and under, keeping the tension even, rolling the braid between his palms to smooth it. The result was a round, tight rope, strong enough to hold a struggling calf. The boy's eyes went wide. He took the rope, pulled on it, and grinned. 4 is better than 3, Luke said. By evening, 3 other boys and 2 women were watching him. Luke taught them the diamond hitch for securing packs so they would not slip on steep trails. He showed them how to use a heated awl to punch holes in a saddle skirt to repair a tear, stitching it with the sinew they had prepared. He showed them how to check a horse's gums to see if the colic was setting in, a trick that saved a mare 2 days later. In return, the canyon began to teach him. Nayland took him out one morning to a dry wash that looked like a grave for stones. There is water here, Nayland said, pointing at a patch of sand that looked identical to the rest. I see nothing but dust, Luke said. You look with your eyes, Nayland said, tapping her temple. You must look with the roots. See the willow? It is small, stunted, but it lives. She handed him a digging stick. Luke dug, 3 feet down. The dry sand turned cool and damp. Another foot, and water seeped into the hole, muddy but sweet. They taught him how to read the wind. An older woman named Dasan showed him how the morning breeze carried the scent of wet sage from the high peaks, signaling rain days before it arrived. They taught him how to walk. Luke had always moved like a white man, heels striking hard, boots crunching. The women moved like water. They taught him to place the ball of his foot first, to feel the ground before committing his weight, to move through the brush without snapping a twig. Mutual dependence formed, not out of friendship, but out of the brutal necessity of the desert. They needed his strength and his knowledge of horses. He needed their wisdom to keep from dying of thirst or exposure. The hate was still there, simmering like coals under ash, but the fire of it was cooling into a wary respect. Ayanna remained the hardest flint to break. Nayland, with her sharp eye for utility, had paired Luke and Ayanna together for the care of the horses. It was a logical choice. Luke knew stock better than anyone in the camp, and Ayanna was the best rider. Their mornings were spent in the rope corral or out in the narrow box canyon where they grazed the animals. The air between them was often sharp, filled with the static of unspoken history. You ride like a sack of grain, Ayanna commented one morning as they moved the herd to a new patch of grass. You sit too heavy. The horse carries you. You do not move with him. I ride like a man who has spent 12 hours a day in the saddle for 10 years, Luke retorted, adjusting his hat. It gets the job done. It tires the horse, Ayanna said, her voice cool. You fight the animal. You want to conquer it. We become the animal. She kicked her heels, and her pony surged forward, leaping a fallen log with a grace that made horse and rider look like a single creature. Luke watched her, grudgingly admiring the way she sat, loose yet controlled, her braids flying behind her like black whips. The test came 3 days later. A young paint pony, skittish and half wild, broke its tether. It bolted toward the canyon mouth, heading for the dangerous labyrinth of ravines that led out to the open desert. If it escaped, it was gone forever. He is loose, Ayanna shouted. Luke was already moving. He vaulted onto the black stallion he had been grooming, riding bareback, with only a halter. I will cut him off at the ridge, Luke yelled. You drive him from the bottom. They rode hard. The terrain was a nightmare of loose shale and jagged rocks. Luke pushed the stallion, trusting the animal's footing. He scrambled up a steep slope, rocks clattering down behind him. Below, he saw Ayanna galloping through the wash, her body low over her pony's neck, her voice driving the runaway horse toward the trap. Luke reached the top of the ridge and spurred the stallion down a treacherous slide. He hit the canyon floor just as the paint pony came around the bend. Luke hauled back on the halter, sliding the stallion to a halt, blocking the path. The paint pony reared, confused. Ayanna was there a second later. She slipped from her horse while it was still moving, landing softly in the dust. She moved toward the panicked animal, crooning low, rhythmic sounds. Luke slid off the stallion and moved to the other side. They boxed the pony in. Luke raised his arm slowly, limiting the space, while Ayanna moved in for the capture. Steady, Luke murmured. Steady now. Ayanna reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and grabbed the trailing rope. The pony snorted but stood still, boxed in by the 2 humans. Ayanna secured the rope. She looked up at Luke. They were standing 5 feet apart, chests heaving from the exertion, covered in dust and sweat. The air crackled. It was the adrenaline of the chase. Yes, but it was something else. Too, it was the sudden, sharp intimacy of shared danger. You ride well, for a sack of grain, Ayanna said. She was breathless, her eyes wide and dark. You are not so bad yourself, Luke replied. He wiped the grit from his forehead. For a ghost? Ayana didn't look away. For a moment, the barrier of war and blood seemed to thin. Luke looked at her mouth, then at the pulse beating in her throat. He felt a sudden, dangerous pull, a desire to close the distance, to taste the dust on her skin. The paint pony tossed its head, breaking the spell. Ayana stepped back, her face closing down like a shutter. "We should get back," she said, her voice tight. "Nayland will worry." She vaulted onto her horse and rode away without looking back. Luke watched her go, his heart hammering against his ribs, knowing that something had shifted in the canyon, something far more volatile than a runaway horse. The storm hit a week later. It began as a strange copper tint to the sky in the west. The wind died completely, leaving a vacuum of silence that made the dogs whine and pace. Then, the horizon simply disappeared. A wall of brown darkness, thousands of feet high, was rolling toward them, swallowing the mountains. "Sandstorm!" Dasan screamed. The camp erupted. This was not a dust devil. This was a haboob, a monster born of the dying summer heat. Luke dropped the wood he was carrying and ran to the wickiups. The wind hit them with the force of a physical blow, screaming like a banshee. The air turned instantly into a grinding slurry of sand and gravel. Visibility dropped to the end of his arm. "Get the children inside!" Luke roared, though he could barely hear his own voice. He saw Sani struggling with the flap of her shelter. The wind was tearing it from her hands. Luke lunged, grabbing the canvas and wrestling it down, lashing it tight to the stakes. "Inside," he ordered, shoving her and her son into the darkness of the shelter. He moved to the next wickiup. It was Cheese. The main support pole was cracking under the pressure of the wind. The old woman was inside, huddled under a blanket, wailing. Luke dove inside. He grabbed the fracturing pole, wrapping his arms around it, bracing his shoulder against the wood. He became the pillar. The structure groaned and shook, the wind hammering against the sides. But Luke held it. The storm raged for hours. Sand filled his nose, his mouth, his eyes. It scoured his skin raw, but he did not let go. Outside, in the howling gray, Ayana was checking the horse lines. She saw a figure moving through the gloom. It was Luke, leaving Chee's stabilized tent to run toward a group of children huddled behind a rock. He grabbed two of them, shielding their faces with his own jacket, his body taking the brunt of the stinging grit as he hustled them toward the safety of a cave at the canyon wall base. He was coughing, his eyes red and streaming, but he did not stop. He did not retreat to the safety of the cave for himself. He turned back into the wind to check the next shelter. Ayana watched him, shielding her eyes. A strange sensation twisted in her gut. He was fighting the wind for them. He was bleeding for them. It was becoming harder and harder to see the monster she wanted to hate. The storm died at midnight, leaving the canyon buried in drifts of fine silt. The silence returned, ringing in their ears. Luke collapsed just before dawn. He had spent 6 hours fighting the wind, breathing in the dust. His lungs, already scarred from years of rough living, rebelled. He fell near the fire pit, his body shaking with a sudden, violent rigor. By morning, the fever was burning him alive. The women gathered around him. He lay on a buffalo robe, his breathing ragged and shallow. "He is done," an older woman named Coco said, looking down at him. "The dust fever. It takes the strong ones fast. We should let him go," another woman whispered. "He has served his purpose. If he dies, the debt is paid." Nayland stood at the head of the pallet. She looked at Luke's face, which was flushed a dark, unhealthy red. "He saved your shelter. Chi," Nayland said sharply. "He shielded Sani's boy. He held the roof over my head." "He is still white," Coco muttered. "He is useful," Nolan insisted, "and perhaps he is more." She turned to Ayana, who was standing at the edge of the circle, her arms crossed. "You will tend him." "Ayana? Me?" Ayana stepped back. "Why?" "Because you wanted to kill him the most," Nolan said. "If he lives, it will be because you willed it. If he dies, it will be on your hands. It is a test, daughter. For him. And for you," Ayana argued. But Nolan's word was law. For 3 days and 3 nights, Luke drifted in the dark waters of delirium. Ayana sat beside him in the small, separate wickiup they used for the sick. She wiped his forehead with cool water. She trickled herbal tea between his cracked lips. She listened. In the grip of the fever, Luke's defenses crumbled. He mumbled, his voice thick with panic. "Will, get down," he shouted suddenly, thrashing on the robes. "The ridge! They are on the ridge!" Ayana held his shoulders, pushing him back down. "Shh! There is no one on the ridge. I told them," Luke moaned, tears leaking from his closed eyes. "I told them the village was empty. I did not know. Will, I did not know about the women." Ayana froze. Her hand hovered over his chest. "San Carlos," Luke whispered. "The river, the fire. Oh God, the fire! Sarah, I am sorry." Ayana sat back, her heart cold. He was dreaming of the violence, but he was not dreaming of glory. He was dreaming of horror. She heard the names of places she knew, places where her people had been slaughtered. She heard the name of the river where her cousin had died. He was there, she realized. But the anger that should have come did not burn as hot as she expected. Instead, it was doused by the misery in his voice. He sounded like a child lost in the dark. He sounded like she felt when she woke up screaming from her own nightmares. "He is haunted," Ayana thought, "just like us." She looked at his face, stripped of its guard. She felt a confusing swirl of pity and suspicion. He was the enemy, yes, but he was a man who carried his own ghosts, and the weight of them was crushing him. Luke broke the fever on the 4th night. He woke to darkness and the smell of sage smoke. He was weak, his body feeling as if it had been beaten with clubs. He turned his head. Ayana was sitting near the entrance, half in shadow, mending a moccasin by the light of a single tallow candle. "Water," Luke croaked. Ayana moved instantly. She lifted his head and held a gourd to his lips. He drank greedily. Slowly, she commanded, "You will be sick." He laid his head back, blinking at her. You are still here. I am here," Ayana said. Setting the gourd down, Naylan ordered it. Luke watched her. The memory of the storm was hazy, but he remembered her hands. He remembered her voice pulling him back from the edge. "I had dreams," Luke whispered. "I know," Ayana said. "You talk in your sleep. Carver, you talk of rivers and fires. You talk of a brother named Will." Luke closed his eyes. The shame washed over him, fresh and raw. "He was my younger brother," Luke said. "He died 3 years ago. Apache arrow." Ayana did not flinch. "My husband died 3 years ago. Soldier's bullet." The silence in the small hut was heavy, but it was not empty. It was filled with the wreckage of their shared history. "Why did you ride with them?" Ayana asked quietly. "You do not hate us. I have seen you with the children. You are not a killer by nature. Why did you scout for the blue coats?" Luke stared at the roof poles. "I was 22, he said. I had nothing. My father left us debt and dry dirt. I wanted to buy a future. The army paid in gold." He turned his head to look at her. "It was not about hate, Ayana. It was about being poor. I was scared of being powerless. I thought if I had the gold, I could build a wall high enough to keep the world out." He laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "I bought the ranch, and the war followed me home anyway." Ayana looked down at her hands. "I had a dream once," she said softly, "before the soldiers came. I dreamed of a valley where the corn grew tall and the children did not wake up screaming. I wanted to be a woman who made things, not a woman who sharpened knives." She looked up, her dark eyes locking with his blue ones. "We are both fools. Carver, we thought we could choose our lives, but the land chooses for us." The emotional closeness was suffocating. It was too intimate, too real. Luke felt a sudden, desperate urge to reach out and touch her hand, to bridge the gap between their tragedies. Ayana saw it in his eyes. She tensed, fear flickering across her face. Not fear of him, but fear of what she was feeling. "Rest," she said abruptly. She blew out the candle, plunging them into darkness. "Sleep. You are not dead yet." Recovery was slow. It was another week before Luke could walk without a staff. One afternoon, the air crisp with the coming autumn, they sat together near the corral. repairing a saddle cinch. The conversation turned, as it often did, to the war that raged outside the canyon walls. "You talk like a victim," Ayanna said, slicing a piece of leather with swift, angry strokes. "You say you had no choice. There is always a choice. I never said I was a victim," Luke said, threading a needle. "I am not the victim in this story. Ayanna, I know that. You are. The women here are." "Then do not ask for forgiveness," she snapped. "I do not want forgiveness." Luke's voice rose, startling a nearby horse. "I do not expect you to forgive me. I do not forgive myself." "Then what do you want?" Ayanna demanded, turning to face him. "Why do you stay? Why do you work yourself to death? Why do you save our children?" "Because I want to be something else," Luke shouted back. He dropped the saddle and grabbed her shoulders. The contact shocked them both. "I cannot change what I did," Luke said, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "I cannot bring back the dead, but I can be something else now. I can be the man who stands between you and the wind. Is that not enough?" Ayanna stared at him. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. The anger in her eyes melted into something terrified and hungry. She looked at his mouth. Luke looked at hers. The distance between them vanished. The memory of the horse chase, the storm, the nights in the sick room, it all crashed together in a single moment of magnetic pull. Luke leaned in. Ayanna did not pull away. Their breath mingled. Then, just as his lips brushed hers, she gasped. "No!" She jerked back, shoving him away hard. She scrambled to her feet, her hand flying to her mouth as if she had been burned. "I cannot," she whispered. I swore I would hate you." She turned and ran, disappearing into the maze of wiki-ups, leaving Luke sitting in the dust, his heart pounding like a war drum, the taste of her fear and her desire still on his lips. The camp was small. Nothing went unnoticed. The women began to talk. Luke heard the whispers as he hauled water. "She looks at him like a woman looks at a husband," one would say. "He is a wolf in the fold," another would warn. "He will turn on us." Chi, the old woman Luke had saved during the storm, stopped him one day. She placed a withered hand on his arm. "You are a good worker. Carver," she said, "you have a strong back. But do not forget, you are white. You can fight for us. You can bleed for us. But you will never belong to us. The blood is too deep." Luke said nothing, but the words cut. He knew she was right. He was living on borrowed time, in a borrowed life. And then the time ran out. A trader arrived 2 days later. He was a Comanchero, a man who moved between the worlds of the white settlements and the hidden tribes, trading guns for horses and information for gold. He sat by the fire with Nalin and the elders. Luke was kept at a distance, but he watched the faces of the women turn ashen. When the trader left, Nalin summoned the camp. "The noose tightens," Nalin said, her voice heavy. "The trader brings news from Fort Bowie. There is a new colonel. He has orders to clear the territory." She looked around the circle, her gaze lingering on the children. "They are not just hunting warriors anymore. They are sweeping the canyons. They are burning the food caches. They have taken the band at Turkey Creek. Those who resisted were shot." A ripple of fear went through the women. "And they are coming this way," Nalin finished. "They know there are stragglers in the Dragoon Mountains. They will be here before the moon is full." Luke felt a cold pit open in his stomach. The outside world, the world of maps and generals and relentless progress, was coming to crush this fragile sanctuary. He looked across the fire at Ayanna. She was looking at him. Her eyes were wide, filled with the realization that the fragile peace they had built and the dangerous love they had almost touched was about to be swept away by the tide of war. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was a man standing in the path of a storm he had helped create. And this time, there was no shelter strong enough to hold it back. The map was drawn in the dust with the sharp end of a greasewood stick. It was a crude representation of the territory, a web of jagged lines representing ridges, dry washes, and the thin, treacherous veins of seasonal creeks. Luke Carver squatted on his heels, his hat pushed back on his head, ignoring the sweat that trickled down his temple. Around him, The women of the council stood like statues carved from ironwood. Naylin leaned on her staff, her eyes following the movement of the stick. Ayanna stood slightly apart, her arms crossed, watching Luke's hands. "They will not come through the main pass," Luke said, his voice rough with the dryness of the air. "It is too narrow. A column of cavalry needs width. They have supply wagons, artillery perhaps. They will come from the southeast, circling the blind side of the black rocks." He slashed a line through the dust. "How many?" Nolan asked. "If it is a full campaign," Luke answered, looking up at her. "Maybe 200 men, plus scouts, plus Indian trackers who know this land better than I do." A murmur of unease rippled through the women. 200 soldiers against 30 women, a few old men, and children. It was not a battle. It was an execution. "How fast?" Ayanna asked. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the fear. Luke hesitated. He looked at the map, calculating. If they are moving heavy, 10 miles a day. If they leave the wagons behind and ride hard, 30. They could be at the canyon mouth in 3 days, maybe 4. He pointed to a narrow choke point on his dirt map. "Here," Luke said. "The slot canyon at Painted Rock. They have to pass through single file. If you put shooters high up on the rim, you can stop them. You can drop rocks. You can spook the horses. You cannot defeat them, but you can make them bleed enough to turn back." Naylin nodded slowly. She looked at Luke with a strange expression, part suspicion, part grudging respect. "You give us the knife to cut your own people." "Carver, they are not my people," Luke said quietly. "Not anymore." He stood up, wiping the dust from his hands. He felt the weight of Ayanna's gaze on him. He met her eyes. There was gratitude there. Yes, he saw it. But beneath the gratitude was a deep, darkening dread. Ayanna looked away first. She was terrified, not just of the soldiers, but of what was happening inside her own chest. Every time Luke showed them how to survive, every time he drew a map, or fixed a rifle, or taught them to read the cavalry bugle calls, he wove himself tighter into their lives. She found herself looking for him in the mornings. She found herself wondering if he had eaten. It was a weakness, and in the borderlands, weakness got you killed. The next morning, the sky was a sheet of hammered tin, bright and merciless. Naylin ordered a scouting party to ride south to confirm the rumors. She chose Ayanna to lead it, and she ordered Luke to go with them. "He stays on a lead rope." Nolan instructed, "If he tries to signal the soldiers, you put a bullet in his spine." They rode out in a group of 4, Ayanna, Luke, and 2 younger women who were skilled with the bow. Luke rode the black stallion, his hands bound loosely to the saddle horn, his horse's lead line held by Ayanna. The landscape they traversed was a graveyard of geology. Great slabs of red rock thrust up from the earth, twisted by ancient fires. The arroyos were deep scars cut by violent floods that only happened once a decade. The sagebrush was brittle, snapping like dry bones when the horses brushed past. Heat shimmered off the rocks in waves, making the distant mountains dance and dissolve. High above, 3 vultures circled in a slow, lazy spiral, waiting for the sun to finish what the drought had started. They rode in silence for hours, the only sound the crunch of hooves and the creak of leather. Luke scanned the horizon, his old instincts flaring. He smelled the wind, tasting for dust, for smoke, for the acrid scent of nervous horses. By mid-afternoon, they found what they were looking for. Ayanna raised her hand, halting the group. She pointed to the ground. "Tracks." Luke leaned forward. "Shod horses. Deep impressions. They were moving fast." He looked at the pattern. "A patrol," he said softly. 12 men, moving north. They followed the trail cautiously, keeping to the high ground, using the shadows of the rocks for cover. 3 miles further on, they came upon the remains of an encampment. It had been a temporary bivouac. The ashes of the fire were cold, but not old, perhaps 2 days. Ayanna dismounted and walked through the site. She found a discarded tin of tobacco, a broken spur strap, and the ruts of a light wagon. Then she stopped, near a cluster of mesquite bushes. The earth had been disturbed, a shallow mound, hastily covered with rocks. Ayana walked toward it. Luke watched her, his heart heavy. He knew what was under those rocks. She knelt and moved a stone. Underneath lay a small, beaded pouch, a medicine bag, and a single, broken arrow. Apache, one of the younger women whispered. Ayana did not speak. She stood up, her face a mask. Someone had been caught here, a straggler, a scout from another band. They had been killed and buried in a hole too shallow to keep the coyotes out. She looked at the tracks leading away. They went north, toward the canyon. They know, Ayana said. Her voice was hollow. They are not just sweeping. They are hunting. They camped that night in a narrow side canyon, hidden from the main trail. They dared not light a large fire, only a small, smokeless flame in a pit to boil coffee and warm their hands against the sudden desert chill. The two younger women took the first watch at the canyon entrance. Luke and Ayana sat by the fire. Luke's hands were untied for the evening, but his rifle remained with Ayana. He sat with his back to the rock wall, watching the flames lick at the dry wood. Ayana sat opposite him, wrapping her blanket tighter around her shoulders. The discovery of the grave had shaken her. The reality of the approaching army was no longer a rumor. It was a set of hoofprints leading to her home. "Why did she die?" Ayana asked suddenly. Luke looked up, startled. "Who? Your woman? The one in the grave on the hill?" Luke stared into the fire. He had not spoken of Sarah to anyone in a long time, not the truth of it. Her name was Sarah. Luke said she was 22. She liked to plant flowers, even though the sun killed them every year. She said the land needed color. He picked up a twig and snapped it. It was a skirmish. A raiding party came through, stealing horses. They were not looking for a fight, I think, but my brother, Will, he was hot-headed. He saw them taking the stock. He opened fire. Luke closed his eyes. It was chaotic. Dust everywhere. Gun smoke. Sarah ran out onto the porch to pull Will inside. A stray bullet hit her. I do not even know who fired it. It might have been the Apache. It might have been Will in his panic. It does not matter. She fell, and the flowers she planted were crushed under her body. He looked at Ayana. I was not there. I was 50 miles away, guiding a column of soldiers to a waterhole. By the time I got back, the earth was already settled on her grave. Ayana listened, her face unreadable in the dancing light. She saw the pain in him, raw and unhealed. It mirrored her own. My husband was named Coda, Ayana said softly. He was a weaver. He did not like to fight. He made blankets with patterns of the stars. She touched the necklace of turquoise beads at her throat. We were camped at the river. We thought we were safe. The treaty had been signed, but the soldiers came at dawn. They said we had broken the rules. They did not say which rules. Coda ran to get our son. He was shot in the back. She looked at Luke, her eyes shining with unshed tears. My son was 3. He had just learned to walk without holding on. I carried him for 3 days after he died. I could not leave him. The silence between them was heavy, but it was not the silence of enemies. It was the silence of two people standing in the wreckage of the same storm. Luke felt a profound, aching sorrow for her. He looked at her face, the strength in her jaw, the sadness in her mouth, and felt something break inside him. It was the wall he had built to keep the world out. I'm sorry. Ayana, he whispered. He reached out across the small space between them. He didn't think about it. He just wanted to offer comfort. His hand brushed hers. The contact was electric. Ayana's breath hitched. She looked at his hand, rough and scarred, covering hers. For a moment, she did not pull away. Her fingers curled slightly, responding to the warmth. Desire flared in the cold night air, sudden, fierce, and terrifying. It was a hunger for life in the midst of death. Luke leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. He saw the same hunger there. He saw the woman beneath the warrior. Ayana, he breathed. She looked at him, her eyes widening. For a second, she leaned in. Then, the memory of the grave they had found that afternoon crashed back into her mind. The broken arrow, the tracks of the shod horses. She snatched her hand back as if he had burned her. No! She scrambled backward, pulling the blanket tight like a shield. I cannot, she said, her voice trembling. I cannot take comfort from you, Carver, not while your people hunt mine, not while the ghosts are watching. Ayanna, Luke said, holding his hands up. I am not my people. You are, she said, her voice hardening. You cannot wash the white off your skin, and I cannot wash the red off mine. There is a river of blood between us, and it is too wide to swim. She stood up, turning her back to him. Go to sleep, she commanded, her voice thick with emotion. We ride at dawn. Luke sat there, his hand still tingling where he had touched her, watching her shoulders shake as she fought to control her weeping. He realized then that he loved her, and he realized, with a sinking heart, that his love might be the thing that destroyed her. They returned to the main canyon 2 days later, exhausted and grim. The news they brought, of the tracks, the proximity of the soldiers, spread through the camp like a fever. But before they could even dismount, a shout went up from the sentries at the narrow entrance. There was a scuffle, the sound of a struggle, and then a man was dragged into the clearing. He was not a soldier. He was a scout, dressed in buckskins and a faded cavalry hat. He was mixed race, his skin the color of polished bronze, his hair long and greasy. His hands were tied behind his back, and his face was bruised from a fresh beating. Luke swung down from his horse. He froze. He knew this man. It was Miguel, a tracker Luke had ridden with for 3 years, a man who drank too much whiskey and talked too much when he did. Miguel looked up, spitting blood into the dust. His eyes locked on Luke. Well, hell, Miguel croaked, a bloody grin spreading across his face. I heard you were dead. Carver, Jubal said the Apache took you. I figured your scalp was drying on a lodgepole by now. The women crowded around. Naylin stepped forward, her face thunderous. You know this man? She asked Luke. Luke nodded slowly. His stomach churned. Yes, his name is Miguel. He scouts for the 3rd Cavalry. He did, Miguel corrected. I am freelance now. Just passing through, looking for opportunities. Ayanna stepped forward. She looked from Luke to Miguel. He is a spy, she said. No, darling. Miguel laughed, though it sounded nervous. Just a traveler. But seeing old Carver here, that is a surprise. Miguel looked at Luke, his eyes narrowing. You look cozy. Carver. Working for the squaws now? That is a long way to fall for the hero of Arroyo Seco. The name of the place hung in the air like smoke. Arroyo Seco. Ayanna went rigid. The color drained from her face. What did you say? She whispered. Miguel looked at her, then back at Luke. He sensed the tension, and like a coyote sensing a wounded rabbit, he pounced. You did not tell them, Miguel asked Luke, his voice mocking. He turned to the women. This man is a legend. Best tracker General Crook ever had. He's the one who found the trail to Arroyo Seco 3 years ago. No, Luke said, stepping forward. Miguel, shut your mouth. He found the waterhole, Miguel continued, raising his voice. He led the dragoons right to the edge of the canyon. Dawn raid? We caught them sleeping. It was a turkey shoot. Ayanna turned to Luke. Her eyes were wide, black holes of horror. Arroyo Seco, she said, her voice barely audible. That was my village. Luke felt the world drop out from under him. The blood roared in his ears. He remembered Arroyo Seco. He remembered the map. He remembered pointing the finger. Ayanna, you led them there. Ayanna said, it was not a question. Luke looked at her. He could not lie. Not to her. Not anymore. I tracked a raiding party, Luke said, his voice pleading. They told me it was a war camp. They told me it was the men who had burned the freight wagons. I did not know there were families. I did not know it was a village. But you led them. Ayanna screamed. The sound tore through the canyon. You led them. She lunged at him, her knife flashing in her hand. 2 of the other women grabbed her, holding her back. She struggled, screaming, tears streaming down her face. You killed him! You killed my son! You pointed the gun! Luke stood there. He did not move. He did not try to defend himself. The guilt he had carried for years suddenly had a face. It had a name. It had the eyes of the woman he loved. "I did not know," Luke whispered. But the words were ash in his mouth. Miguel watched, a cruel smile on his lips. He had thrown the match, and now he was watching the fire burn. "Tie him!" Nayland roared. The old warriors rushed Luke. He did not fight. They slammed him against the post, the same post he had been tied to when he first arrived. They bound his hands so tight the rope cut into his skin. Ayana broke free from the women. She stood before him, her chest heaving, her face wet with tears. "I trusted you," she sobbed. "I let you touch my hand. I am sorry," Luke said. Tears blurred his own vision. "Ayana, I would give my life to change it." "Your life is not enough," she shrieked. "It is not enough." The council that followed was a storm of fury. The women gathered in a tight circle, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of grief and rage. The revelation had shattered the fragile trust Luke had built. He was no longer the rancher who fixed fences. He was the architect of their destruction. "Kill him," Ayana demanded, pacing the circle like a trapped cat. "He is a murderer. He is the reason we are hiding in this hole. He deserves to die slowly. He has saved us." "Too," Sani argued, though her voice was shaking. "He saved my boy. He fixed the well. He did it to save his own skin." Ayana countered. "He is a liar. He has been lying every day. Every time he looked at us. He knew what he had done. He did not know it was your village," Nayland said quietly. "It does not matter," Ayana screamed. "The dead do not care what he knew." She turned to Nalin, pointing a trembling finger at Luke, who sagged against the post, his head hanging low. "If we let him live, we insult every ghost in the ground. We invite the bad spirits. He must die." Tonight, the women debated. The moral tangle was raw and bitter. Some wanted revenge. Some, the more pragmatic ones, looked at the coming war and wondered if they could afford to kill their only military advisor. But the pain was too fresh. The name Arroyo Seco was a wound that would not close. "We will vote," Nalin decided. She picked up a black stone and a white stone. Luke watched them. He felt a strange sense of calm. He deserved this. He had always known, deep down, that the past would catch him. He looked at Ayana. She was staring at him with a hatred that broke his heart, but he did not blame her. "If you are going to do it," Luke said, his voice carrying across the silence, "do it quick." He looked at Ayana. "I only ask one thing. If the soldiers come, hide the children high up. Do not let them fight. Promise me." Ayana stared at him. She saw the resignation in his eyes. She saw the acceptance. He was not begging for his life. He was begging for her son's memory, and for the sons who were still alive. It confused her. It made her hate him more and love him more, all at once. Before Nalin could call for the stones, a sound shattered the tension. A horse, ridden hard, crashed through the brush at the canyon entrance. It was one of the young scouts Nalin had sent out to watch the southern passes. The boy slid from his pony, collapsing in the dust. He was wounded, blood soaking his leg. "Nalin," the boy gasped. The women rushed to him. Nalin knelt, grabbing his shoulder. "Speak," she commanded. "Dust," the boy wheezed. "Huge dust. The blue coats. They are not 3 days away. They forced the march. They are at the Black Rocks." He looked up, his eyes wide with panic. "They will be here by sunset." The camp went silent. Sunset was 4 hours away. The argument over Luke's life evaporated instantly, replaced by the cold reality of imminent annihilation. "We fight," Nalin said, standing up. Her voice was steel. "Gather the weapons. Move the children to the caves." She looked at Luke, still tied to the post. "And him?" Ayana asked, her voice trembling. Nayland looked at Luke. Then she looked at the terrified faces of her people. "We need every gun," Nalin said. "Even he will betray us." Ayana cried. "He has nowhere to go," Nalin said. "If the soldiers find him here, fighting with us, they will hang him as a traitor. He is one of us now, whether he likes it or not." Nalin turned to Ayana. "Cut him loose." "Me?" Ayana recoiled. "You," Nalin said. "You hold his life in your hands. If you want him to fight, you must free him." Ayanna stared at her matriarch, then at Luke. The conflict inside her was a physical pain. She hated him for Arroyo Seco. She hated him for the lie, but the thought of the soldiers, the men who had actually pulled the triggers, coming here to kill Sani, to kill the children. That hate was older and deeper. She drew her knife. She walked over to Luke. She stood close to him. He could smell the sage in her hair. He could see the tears drying on her cheeks. She reached behind him. She did not be gentle. She sawed at the ropes with angry, jerky movements. The ropes fell away. Luke rubbed his wrists. He looked at her. Ayanna did not step back. She reached down and picked up a Winchester rifle from the pile of weapons. She shoved it into his chest. Luke grabbed it. Their hands met on the cold metal of the gun. "If you turn this on us," Ayanna hissed, her eyes locking with his, "I will kill you before you can pull the trigger." "I know," Luke said, but there was more than a threat in her eyes. There was a desperate, terrifying plea. "Protect us. Protect me. Make up for what you did." They stood there for a heartbeat. Two people bound by blood and history, standing on the edge of the end of the world. Luke nodded. "Let's go," he said. He turned toward the canyon entrance, checking the action of the rifle. Ayanna watched him for a second, then turned and ran to gather her arrows. The trial was over. The war had begun. The canyon was no longer a home. It was a machine built for death. In the final hours of light, the camp transformed. The domestic rhythm of grinding corn and tanning hides vanished, replaced by a cold, frantic efficiency. The women worked with a silence that was more terrifying than screaming. They were not soldiers, but they were survivors of a 30-year war, and they knew how to turn their sanctuary into a slaughterhouse. Luke Carver stood at the narrow neck of the canyon, the place where the walls pinched in until they were barely 20 feet apart. He pointed to the overhangs that loomed 50 feet above. "Stack the heavy stones there," Luke said, his voice raspy. "And there. Do not drop them when the first rider comes through. Wait until the column is fully engaged. You want to trap the tail, not just crush the head." Nayland nodded, translating the orders to the older women. They moved with surprising strength, levering massive boulders into precarious positions using cedar poles, ready to be tipped with a single shove. High above, in the crevices that scarred the upper cliff face, the mothers were hiding the children. It was a heartbreaking procession. Small bodies were tucked into cracks in the red stone, covered with brush and blankets. Sani was there, pressing a finger to her son's lips, her eyes wet but her hands steady. "If you hear shooting, do not move," Sani whispered. "Even if I call for you, do not move until the moon comes up." Luke watched them go. He felt a sickness in his gut. He knew the tactics of the cavalry. If they broke through the defense, they would scour the walls. He turned to Ayanna. She was sharpening arrows, her movements jerky and violent. She had not looked at him since she cut his bonds. The anger was still radiating off her, but it was mixed now with a terrified focus. "Ayanna," Luke said. She did not look up. "Save your breath. Carver, save it for the shooting." Luke grabbed her wrist. The contact was startling. She froze, the knife hovering over the arrow shaft. "Listen to me," Luke said, his voice low and urgent. "The kill box will hold them for a while, but if they have mountain howitzers, they will blast through the rock fall. We have no cannons," Ayanna hissed, pulling her arm away. "We have rocks and hate. If they flank," Luke continued, ignoring her hostility, "they will come up the goat trail on the south ridge. It is steep, but a determined man can climb it. If they get up there, they will be above the children." Ayanna's eyes widened. She looked up at the south ridge, a jagged spine of rock that looked impassable, but offered a blind spot to the main defenses. "I will watch the ridge," Ayanna said. "No," Luke said. "You are the best shot with the bow. Nayland needs you at the choke point. I will watch the ridge." "You?" Ayanna laughed, a brittle sound. "You want to guard our back door? The man who led them to Arroyo Seco?" Luke flinched, but he did not back down. "I am the only one with a Winchester who can hit a target at 300 yards, he said. "You can trust me, or you can let them take the high ground. Choose." "Ayanna." She stared at him. The history between them, the betrayal, the almost kiss, the shared labor, hung in the air, heavy as the thunderheads gathering in the south. She reached into a pouch at her waist and pulled out a handful of cartridges. She slammed them into his chest. "Do not miss," she said. The army arrived an hour before sunset. They did not come quietly. They came with the arrogance of a force that expected to sweep up refuse, not fight a battle. A dust cloud, thick and brown, heralded their approach long before the glint of brass buttons or the sheen of carbine barrels became visible. Captain Silas Thorne rode at the head of the column. He was a man tired of the dust, tired of the heat, and tired of chasing shadows. His intelligence report said this was a camp of stragglers. Women, old men, broken remnants. "Keep your eyes open," Thorne shouted to his lieutenant, "but do not expect much of a fight. They will likely scatter like quail." The column moved into the shadow of the canyon entrance. The horses' hooves clattered on the stone. The soldiers looked up at the towering walls, uneasily adjusting their grips on their Springfield carbines. They felt the oppression of the rock, the way the canyon seemed to be holding its breath, high above, hidden behind a screen of sagebrush. Nalin watched. She raised her hand. "Wait," she whispered to the darkness. The lead riders passed the choke point. The main body of the troop entered the narrow corridor. They were bunching up, anxious to get through the shadows. "Now!" Nalin screamed. The canyon exploded. It did not begin with gunfire. It began with the earth falling. The women on the rim shoved the cedar poles, tons of red sandstone, carefully balanced for this moment, tipped into the void. The sound was deafening, a roar that drowned out the screams of men and horses. The rocks crashed down into the rear of the column, crushing wagons and blocking the retreat. Dust billowed up, instantly blinding the soldiers. Then the arrows came. They rained down from 50 different crevices, silent and deadly. The soldiers, trapped in the confusion and the dust, fired wildly at the cliffs, their bullets chipping uselessly against the stone. Luke was positioned on a high outcropping near the south ridge, overlooking the carnage. He had his rifle shouldered, his cheek pressed against the stock. He saw a sergeant rallying a group of men, trying to form a firing line to suppress the archers on the north wall. Luke took a breath. He let it out. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. Below, the sergeant's horse dropped, hit in the head. The sergeant went down in a tangle of limbs. Luke worked the lever. Clack, clack. He shifted his aim. A corporal was raising a pistol toward Nalin's position. Luke fired again. The dirt exploded at the corporal's feet. The man flinched, his shot going wide. Luke did not shoot to kill. Not yet. His hands shook with the effort of it. These were men wearing the uniform he had once served. They were men who wrote letters home to their mothers in Ohio and New York. But then he saw a trooper break from the chaos, charging toward a lower ledge where two older women were throwing stones. The trooper raised his saber, slashing down. One of the women fell, blood spraying from her neck. Something cold snapped in Luke's chest. The hesitation vanished. He tracked the trooper. He led the target by 6 inches. He fired. The trooper jerked backward, falling from his saddle, dead before he hit the ground. Luke felt a wave of nausea, followed by a grim, hollow resolve. He was no longer a scout. He was no longer a rancher. He was a defender of this canyon, and the price of admission was blood. The battle raged for 20 minutes, a chaotic swirl of noise and death. The soldiers, realizing they were trapped in a kill box, fought with the desperation of rats in a barrel. They dismounted, using their dead horses for cover, pouring disciplined fire into the cliff faces. Bullets whined off the rocks near Luke's head, stinging his face with stone splinters. He kept moving, firing, relocating, firing again. He was a ghost on the ridge, suppressing the soldiers' attempts to organize. Then he saw it, through the drifting smoke. He spotted movement to his right. A squad of 5 soldiers, led by a calm, bearded lieutenant, had slipped away from the main fight. They were scrambling up the steep goat trail Luke had warned about. They were moving fast, hand over hand, heading toward the upper shelf, the shelf where the children were hidden. Luke looked across the canyon. Ayanna was pinned down by heavy fire, unable to see the flank. Naylin was shouting orders, her attention focused on the center. There was no one else. Luke abandoned his cover. He scrambled down from his perch, sliding on the loose shale, hitting the canyon floor at a dead run. He had to cross 50 yards of open ground to reach the base of the goat trail. He sprinted. "Hey!" a soldier shouted from the main group. "There!" Bullets kicked up geysers of dust around his boots. Zip, crack, zip. Luke did not slow down. He pumped his arms, his lungs burning. He reached the base of the trail just as the first soldier in the flanking squad pulled himself over the lip of the ridge. Luke raised his rifle. "Drop it!" Luke roared. The lieutenant turned, startled to see a white man in the midst of the Apache. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. That hesitation saved the children. Luke fired. The lieutenant took the round in the chest and fell backward, knocking the man behind him off balance. But the other 3 soldiers opened fire. Luke felt a sledgehammer hit his left shoulder. The impact spun him around, knocking the rifle from his hand. He hit the ground hard, the world dissolving into a haze of white light and agony. He groaned, trying to reach for his pistol, but his left arm was useless, a dead weight of fire. The remaining soldiers were scrambling up, weapons raised to finish him. Then, a shadow fell over him. Ayanna slid into the dust beside him, her bow singing. "Thwip!" The lead soldier gasped, an arrow sprouting from his throat. "Thwip!" The second soldier took an arrow in the thigh and tumbled down the slope, screaming. The last man, seeing the ferocity of the defense, turned and scrambled back down the rocks, fleeing into the smoke. Ayanna dropped her bow and grabbed Luke's collar, dragging him behind a boulder just as a volley of carbine fire chewed up the ground where he had been lying. "You fool!" Ayanna screamed at him, her face streaked with soot and tears. "You reckless, white fool!" Luke looked up at her, his vision swimming. He clutched his shoulder, blood leaking between his fingers. "The children!" Luke gasped. They were going for the children. Ayanna looked up at the ridge, then back at him. She saw the truth of it. He had run into the fire for them, for her son's memory. She ripped a strip of cloth from her skirt and jammed it into the wound. Luke cried out, arching his back. "Stay down," Ayanna ordered, her voice shaking. "Do not die. Carver, I have not decided if I forgive you yet." The tide turned, but the cost was high. Naylin, seeing the soldiers wavering, had moved from her protected position to drag a young girl, Sani's niece, away from a ricochet zone. She was slow. Her bad leg dragged in the dust. A stray bullet, fired blindly by a panicked recruit, struck her in the side. Naylin fell without a sound. The sight of their matriarch falling sent a shockwave through the women. But instead of breaking them, it solidified them. A terrible, keening cry went up from the canyon walls, a sound of pure, distilled rage. The women abandoned their cover. They poured fire and arrows down into the confusion with renewed fury. The soldiers broke. Captain Thorne, wounded in the arm and seeing his command disintegrating under an assault from an enemy he couldn't see, sounded the retreat. "Fall back!" he screamed. "Fall back to the wagons!" The cavalry retreated in disarray, leaving their dead where they fell. They scrambled over the rockfall, dragging their wounded, firing wildly behind them. The dust began to settle. The shooting tapered off into sporadic pops. Then silence. The canyon was left scarred. Smoke drifted in heavy, acrid sheets. The bodies of horses and men littered the narrow pass. The ground was black with blood. It was a victory. They had held the ground. But as Luke looked around, propped up against the boulder, it felt like no victory at all. The aftermath was a grim business. The women moved among the fallen, retrieving arrows and stripping weapons from the dead. There was no triumph in their faces, only a hard, numb exhaustion. 5 soldiers had been left behind, wounded but alive. They were dragged to the center of the camp and thrown down in the dirt. They looked up at the women with terrified eyes, expecting the torture stories they had been told around the campfire to come true. Ayanna stood over them, her knife in her hand. Her face was a mask of cold fury. "We should kill them all," she said. Her voice was flat. "Cut their throats and leave them for their friends to find." Several of the women nodded, gripping their skinning knives. Sani was there, holding a heavy stone, her eyes filled with a terrifying vacancy. "No," Luke said. He pushed himself up, leaning heavily on a piece of driftwood he was using as a crutch. His left arm was bound tight against his chest, the sling dark with fresh blood. He limped into the circle. "No killing." Ayanna spun on him. "Look around you. Carver, look at Nalin." She pointed to where the matriarch lay on a buffalo robe, her breathing shallow and wet. The medicine woman was working on her, but the look on her face said everything. "They came to kill us," Ayanna shouted. "They came to kill the babies. And you want mercy?" "I do not want mercy," Luke said, swaying slightly. "I want survival." He looked at the captured soldiers. They were young, terrified. One was crying. "If you kill them," Luke said, his voice gaining strength, "the army will not stop. They will come back with 1,000 men. They will burn the mountains down to get to you. They will say you are monsters who massacre prisoners." "They say that anyway," Sani cried. "Make them liars," Luke said. He turned to Ayanna. "Disarm them. Bind their wounds. Give them water, and then send them back." "Send them back?" Ayanna looked at him as if he were mad. "Send them back with a message," Luke said. "Tell them the Apache could have killed them, but chose not to. Tell them that if they leave this canyon alone, you will disappear. Tell them the cost of coming back is too high." He gestured to the dead bodies littering the pass. "Let the dead be the warning. Let the living be the message." Ayanna stepped close to him. She smelled of blood and gunpowder. "Does sparing them erase what they did?" she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of her grief. "Does it bring back my husband? Does it bring back your Sarah? Does it save Nalin?" "No," Luke said softly. "It erases nothing. It fixes nothing." He looked her in the eye. "But adding 5 more bodies to the pile will not bring them back either. It just makes the pile higher. It just makes the nightmare longer." He looked at the women standing in the circle. "You are not them," Luke said. "Do not become them." The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. The women looked at the soldiers, then at Luke, then at Nalin's motionless form. Finally, Ayanna lowered her knife. She looked at the soldiers. "Take their boots," she commanded. "Take their guns. Take their horses." She turned to Luke. "Let them walk back to the fort barefoot. Let them tell their colonel that the women of the canyon gave them their lives." The tension broke. The women moved in, stripping the soldiers of their gear. But Ayanna stopped at the last man. He was a corporal with a thick mustache, the man Luke had seen shooting the older woman at the beginning of the fight, the man who had laughed as she fell. Not him. Ayanna said. Luke started to speak, but Ayanna held up a hand. "No, Carver. You get your message, but justice must be paid. This one enjoyed it." Luke looked at the corporal's eyes. They were mean, hard eyes, even in fear. He remembered the way the man had slashed down with his saber. Luke nodded slowly. He stepped back. He did not ask what would happen. He turned away as the women dragged the corporal toward the deep shadows at the back of the canyon. He heard a single, muffled scream, and then silence. It was a gray world. There were no clean choices. There was only the necessary balance of blood. Nalin died at dawn. The sky was turning a soft, bruised purple in the east, the light touching the highest peaks of the mountains. The camp was quiet, save for the low chanting of the medicine woman. Luke and Ayanna sat on either side of the buffalo robe. Nalin's face was gray, her skin like parchment paper. She had lost too much blood. She opened her eyes. They were cloudy, but the sharp intelligence was still there, flickering like a dying candle. "Ayanna," she whispered. "I am here." "Mother," Ayanna said, gripping the old woman's hand. "Do not stay here," Nalin rasped. "The canyon is poison now. The soldiers will return. We will fight them again," Ayanna said. weeping. "No," Nalin said. "No more fighting. Choose life, daughter. Not just mourning. You have mourned enough for 10 lifetimes. Find a place where the corn will grow." She turned her head, the movement costing her visible effort. She looked at Luke. "Carver, I'm here." "Nalin," Luke said. "Your debt is paid," she whispered. "You bled for the children. You are released." Luke swallowed hard. He felt the tears pricking his eyes. "Thank you, but," Nalin continued, her voice fading to a thread. "A man must decide where his heart lives. You can go back to your people, or you can stand with your family." She squeezed Ayana's hand. "Choose well." She breathed. She closed her eyes. The chest rose once more, hitched, and then settled. The silence that followed was absolute. Ayana bowed her head, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Luke reached out. He placed his hand on Ayana's shoulder. She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, turning her face into his good arm. They sat there as the sun crested the canyon wall, illuminating the carnage and the beauty of the morning. The matriarch was gone. The old world was dead. Luke looked at the rising sun, and he knew Nalin was right. The debt was paid. He was free to go. He could walk out of this canyon, ride back to his ranch, and forget he had ever known the name Ayana. But as he felt the warmth of her grief against his side, he knew that was a lie. He was not free. He was bound tighter than he had ever been by ropes. He was bound by the blood on the ground, by the bullet in his shoulder, and by the fierce, terrified love beating in his chest. The battle was over, but the journey was just beginning. The canyon, once their fortress, now smelled of death. The bodies of the soldiers had been dragged a mile down the trail, left as a grim warning, but the scent of blood and expended powder clung to the red rocks like a second skin. The victory, if it could be called that, was a hollow thing. They had held the ground, but they had revealed their position to the world. 2 days after the battle, the scouts returned with news that turned the blood cold. "There is dust to the east," a young boy reported, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "A big column, maybe 400 men, and the ranchers in the valley are gathering. We saw smoke signals on the ridges. They are calling for a hunt." Nalin was dead. The canyon was compromised. The winter was coming. The women gathered in the center of the camp. The circle was smaller now. There were empty spaces where faces had been just days before. Ayana stood at the head of the fire, her arm bandaged where a rock splinter had sliced her skin. Luke stood at the periphery, his left arm in a sling, his face pale under the deep tan and grime. "We cannot stay," Ayana said. Her voice was flat, stripped of all illusion. "If we stay, we die. They will bring the mountain guns next time. They will bring the Indian scouts who know how to root us out like badgers. Then we must go to the reservation," Sani said. She was holding her son tight against her chest. Her eyes were red from weeping. "At least there is food there. At least the shooting stops." "There is no food there," Ayana countered sharply. "There is rot. There is disease. I have heard the stories. Sani, the beef they send is maggot-ridden. The blankets are thin. The spirit dies before the body does. I will not take my sister's children to a cage." "Then where?" asked Chi, the elder. "We cannot go north. The soldiers are thick as locusts. We cannot go east. We go south," Ayana said. She pointed toward the jagged horizon where the mountains dissolved into the harsh Mexican borderlands. "South?" Chi spat. "That is a death march. The water holes are dry. The Mexican army hates us as much as the Americans do. There are rumors." Luke spoke up. The women turned to him. He stepped forward, leaning on his rifle. He felt the weight of their gaze, not as an enemy anymore, but as something strange and necessary. "I heard talk in the settlements before I came here." Luke said, "There's a valley south of the border, near the Sierra Madre, a place where the lines on the map do not matter so much. They say there are communities there, Apache, Mexican, runaway slaves, white outlaws, people who just want to be left alone. It is a long way," Sani whispered. 300 miles, Luke said. Maybe more. And every mile will be hostile. We will have to move at night. We will have to avoid the towns. We will be ghosts. He looked at Ayanna. I can guide you through the white lands. I know the patrols. I know how the cavalry thinks. I can get you to the border. And then? Ayanna asked. Then we survive, Luke said. Or we do not, but we do it free. The debate raged for hours. It was a terrifying choice. To surrender was to accept a slow, humiliating death of the soul. To run was to risk a violent death of the body. Sani looked at her son. She looked at the canyon walls that had been their home. She looked at Ayanna, whose face was set like stone. I would rather my son die thirsty in the desert than live in chains, Sani said softly. The decision was made. They would run. The departure was not a flight. It was a funeral procession for a way of life. They took only what they could carry. The heavy grinding stones were left behind. The extra hides, the heavy lodge poles, the trinkets, all abandoned. Before they left, they gathered at Nalin's grave. It was a fresh mound of stones near the spring. Ayanna knelt, placing a small pouch of corn pollen on the rocks. We leave you here to guard the water. Mother, Ayanna whispered, we will carry your name to the new place. Luke stood back, feeling like an intruder in this sacred moment of grief. But then Ayanna turned and beckoned to him. Come, she said. Luke walked to the grave. She accepted you. Ayanna said, you should say goodbye. Luke looked down at the stones. He remembered the old woman's fierce eyes, her sharp tongue, and the final mercy she had granted him. Goodbye. Nalin, Luke said softly. Thank you for the life. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folding knife, one of the few things the women had let him keep after the battle. He placed it on the stones. For the journey, he said. They walked out of the canyon at dusk, leaving the fires burning to trick any scouts who might be watching. They did not look back. The rocky walls, which had been a prison for Luke and a fortress for the women, faded into the purple shadows of the twilight. They were homeless now, adrift in a sea of sagebrush and silence. The journey was a crucible. The land they crossed was beautiful and cruel. It was a landscape of vast, empty basins and jagged mountain ranges that tore at the sky. The heat during the day was a physical weight, a hammer that beat against their skulls. The cold at night was a knife that slipped through their thin blankets. They moved like shadows. They slept during the day, hiding in dry washes or under the overhangs of cliffs, huddled together for warmth and camouflage. They walked at night, navigating by the stars and the shape of the ridges. Luke rode point, scouting ahead on the black stallion. Ayanna rode the rear guard. They communicated with hand signals and bird calls, a silent language they had forged in the fire of the canyon. On the fourth day, the water ran out. They were crossing a stretch of alkali flats, a white, blinding expanse of salt and dust. The canteens were dry. The horses hung their heads, their tongues swollen. The children stopped crying because they no longer had the moisture for tears. We have to stop, Sani rasped, her lips cracked and bleeding. The little ones cannot walk. Luke looked at the horizon. There was a faint line of green willows 10 miles to the south. There is a soak there, Luke said. I remember it from a campaign 5 years ago. Coyote Springs. 5 years is a long time in the desert, Ayanna said, her voice rough. We have no choice, Luke said. He gave his horse to Sani, lifting her and her son into the saddle. He walked beside Ayanna. He gave her his arm when she stumbled, and she took it. They walked in a daze, putting one foot in front of the other, driven only by the terrifying will to live. When they reached the willows, the spring was a muddy depression, trampled by cattle, but there was water. They dug with their hands, frantic as animals. They waited for the brown sludge to seep into the holes. They drank it through straining cloths. It tasted of mud and cow manure, but it was the sweetest thing Luke had ever tasted. That night, they camped in the thicket. They dared not light a fire. The darkness was absolute. Luke sat apart from the group, keeping watch. His shoulder throbbed with a dull, sickening ache. The bullet wound was healing, but the infection was a constant threat. He heard a twig snap. Ayanna sat down beside him. She held a small gourd of salve made from grease and crushed herbs. "Your shoulder," she said. Luke unbuttoned his shirt, exposing the angry red pucker of the wound. Ayanna's fingers were cool and gentle as she applied the salve. The smell of the herbs was sharp, cutting through the scent of dust. "You are burning," Ayanna murmured. "It is just the walking." Luke lied. Ayanna finished and sat back, but she did not leave. She pulled her blanket around her shoulders. The night air was biting. "You gave your horse to Sani," she said. "She needed it. You walked 10 miles on a bad leg and a worse shoulder. I am the mule, remember?" Luke smiled faintly in the dark. "That is what Nalin said. I am the beast of burden." "You are not a mule," Ayanna said. Her voice was low, trembling slightly. "You are a fool. A brave, stupid fool." She looked at him. The moon had risen, painting her face in silver and shadow. The exhaustion had stripped away her defenses. The anger that had fueled her for so long was gone, burned away by the desert sun. All that was left was the woman. Luke reached out and took her hand. This time, she did not pull away. "We might not make it," Luke whispered. "The border is still 100 miles away." "I know," Ayanna said. "If we die out here, I want you to know." "Know what?" "That I would choose this," Luke said. "I would choose dying in the dust with you over living 100 years in that cabin without you." Ayanna let out a small, choked sound. She moved closer. The space between them vanished. "Do not talk of dying," she whispered fiercely. "Talk of living." She leaned in and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of salt and grief, and an overwhelming, terrifying hunger. It was the collision of two people who had lost everything but each other. Luke wrapped his good arm around her, pulling her against him. He felt the heat of her body through the rough buckskin. He felt her heart hammering against his chest. They lay back in the dry grass, hidden by the darkness and the willows. There was no romance of soft beds or candlelight. There was only the hard ground, the cold wind, and the fierce, tender union of two survivors claiming a moment of joy in a world that wanted them dead. In the morning, they did not speak of it. They did not need to. The way Ayanna looked at him with a fierce, protective possession said everything. They were no longer just allies. They were kin. The desert exacted its toll. It demanded payment for their passage. A week later, Chi, the elder who had complained the loudest but walked the hardest, simply stopped. She sat down on a rock, looked at the setting sun, and closed her eyes. Her heart, tired of the fear and the miles, gave out. They buried her under a pile of stones in a dry arroyo. They sang the death song in whispers, terrified that the wind would carry the sound to the ranchers they knew were tracking them. 2 days after that, a rattlesnake, seeking warmth in the cooling sand, struck the younger sister of the widow Desan. The bite was on the ankle. The poison moved fast. By midnight, her leg was black. By dawn, she was gone. They left her there. There was no time for a deep grave. The patrol they had been dodging, a group of vigilantes from a mining town, was less than 5 miles behind them. "We have to move," Luke urged, his voice harsh with necessity. "If we stop to mourn, we all join her." Ayanna forced the grieving sister to her feet. They walked on, leaving another piece of their hearts in the dust. The final test was the river. It was not the Rio Grande, but a swollen tributary, fed by sudden storms in the north. The water was brown and angry, churning with debris. It was wide, and the current was fast. "We have to cross," Luke shouted over the roar of the water. "The trackers are behind us. The river will hide our trail." They formed a chain, holding hands, the stronger women on the outside, the children and the sick in the middle. They stepped into the icy water. The current pulled at them, trying to drag them down. Halfway across, the water rose to their chests. Sani, holding her son above her head, slipped on a slick rock. She went down. The current took her instantly. "Sani!" Ayanna screamed. Luke did not hesitate. He lunged, releasing the hand of the woman next to him. He dove into the brown water. He thrashed, fighting the weight of his boots and the pain in his shoulder. He saw Sani's head bob up, gasping. She was holding the boy up. Even as she drowned, Luke reached them. He grabbed Sani's tunic with his good hand. He kicked hard, driving them toward a submerged log. "Grab it!" Luke roared. Sani hooked her arm over the wood. Luke shoved them toward the far bank. Using his body as a rudder against the current, Ayanna and 2 other women waded out from the shallows, forming a human net. They grabbed Sani, the boy, and finally Luke, dragging them onto the mud. They lay there, coughing up water, shivering violently. They were alive. Luke looked back at the river. On the far bank, he saw figures on horseback emerge from the brush. The vigilantes. They stopped at the water's edge. The river was too high, the current too dangerous for horses that were not desperate. The riders watched them for a moment, then turned their mounts around. They had made it. The water that had nearly killed them had saved them. 3 weeks later, they walked out of the desolation and into a valley that looked like a dream. It was hidden between 2 spines of the Sierra Madre, south of the borderline. The grass here was yellow and tall. There was a creek that ran clear over white stones, and scattered along the creek were small adobe houses, their chimneys trailing smoke. A group of riders came out to meet them. They were not soldiers. They were men in sombreros, armed with carbines, but their faces were brown and weathered. Some were Mexican. Some looked Apache. Some were white men with long beards. Luke rode forward, his hands raised. He spoke in Spanish. "We are looking for sanctuary," he croaked. "We have women and children. We are done fighting." The leader of the riders, a man with a scar across his cheek, looked at the ragged group. He saw the starving horses. He saw the bandages. He saw the defiance in Ayanna's eyes. He nodded slowly. "There is land near the south bend," the man said. "It is rocky, but the soil is deep. If you work it, it will grow corn." He looked at Luke. "We have one rule here. Gringo. No flags. No nations. You work, you live, you bring trouble, you leave. We are done with flags," Luke said. It was not paradise. It was a hard, scratchy existence. They had to build their own shelters from mud and straw. They had to clear the rocks by hand. The winter was coming, and food was scarce. But there were no bugles at dawn. There were no patrols. There was only the work and the sleep that came without fear. A month after they arrived, the first frost coated the yellow grass in silver. The women gathered in the largest of the new adobe huts. It was time. Luke was summoned. He stood before them. He was thinner than he had been when he was captured, his face gaunt, his hair long and shaggy, but his eyes were clear. "Nalin gave us a law," Ayanna said. She stood in the center, looking more like a leader than ever before. "She said you would live only as long as you pleased the women of the tribe." Luke nodded. "I remember. She said you must work. You must obey. You must be useful." Ayanna looked around the room. Sani stepped forward. "He saved my son from the horse. He saved him from the river. He dug the well that gave us water when the spring failed. He pleases me." "Dasan?" The widow nodded. "He carried the stones for my house. He buried my sister with respect. He fought the soldiers on the ridge. He pleases me." One by one, the women spoke. They did not speak of the man who had guided the soldiers to Arroyo Seco. That ghost was still there, but it had been buried under the weight of the deeds he had done since. They spoke of the man who had braided ropes, who had held up the roof in the storm, who had taken a bullet for the children. "He has paid the debt," an older woman said. "He is free." Ayanna turned to Luke. "You are released." "Luke Carver," she said formally. "The debt is gone. You are free to leave. You can go north. You can go to the white settlements. You are no longer a prisoner." The room was silent. They waited. Luke looked at the door. It led to the open valley, to the road that could take him back to a world where he spoke the language, where he could be a rancher again, where he didn't have to be a pariah. He looked back at the women. He looked at Sani's son, playing in the corner. He looked at Ayanna. He saw the fear in her eyes, hidden deep behind the stoic mask. She was releasing him because she loved him enough to let him go. Luke took a step forward. He did not speak in English. He spoke in the halting, broken Apache he had learned over the months of captivity. Shika. My family. He pointed to the floor of the hut. Shiani. My home. He looked at Ayana. I do not want to go north, he said, switching to English so there would be no mistake. There is nothing there for me but graves. He walked up to her. He did not touch her, out of respect for the council, but his eyes held hers. I asked to stay. Not as a prisoner, not as a servant. He took a breath. I asked to stay as a partner, to plant the corn, to watch the ridge, to build the house. He paused. Will you have me? Ayana stared at him. Her mask crumbled. A smile, small and trembling, broke through the severity of her face. It will be hard work, she said softly. The ground is rocky. I have strong hands. Luke said, We are stubborn people, she warned. I am a stubborn man. Ayana reached out and took his hand. She squeezed it, her calloused palm rough against his. Then stay. Luke Carver, stay and be one of us. The sun was setting over the Sierra Madre, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and violet. The wind coming down from the peaks was cold, carrying the scent of pine and coming snow. In a small field cleared from the rocky soil, a man and a woman were working. They were hoeing the earth, turning the soil in preparation for the spring planting that was months away. Luke stopped and leaned on his hoe, wiping his brow. He looked at the rows they had finished. It was a small patch. Pitiful, really, compared to the ranch he had lost, but it was theirs. Ayana stopped beside him. She looked tired, her dress dusty, her boots worn through, but she was alive. She looked at him and smirked. You missed a spot. White man. Luke laughed. It was a rusty sound, unused for years, but it felt good in his chest. I left it for you, he said. I didn't want you to get bored. She bumped her shoulder against his. It was a simple gesture, domestic and easy. They stood there for a moment, watching the sun dip below the jagged ridge. They were exiles. They were outcasts. They carried the scars of bullets and the ghosts of the dead. The world still hated them, and the winter would be hard. But as Luke put his arm around her, and she leaned her head against his chest, none of that mattered. They had survived the fire. They had survived the flood. And against all the odds, against all the history that said they should be enemies, they had chosen each other. Luke Carver looked at the woman he loved, and for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the dust and the heartache of the American West, and I hope Luke and Ayana's story resonated with you. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you listening from? Did you agree with the women's decision to leave the canyon? And what did you think of Luke's choice at the end? Please share your thoughts in English. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of grit, survival, and romance from the frontier, please make sure to subscribe to From Wild West. There are many more stories to tell, and I can't wait to share them with you. Until next time, keep your powder dry.